And welcome. So this is Kelli McCloud Schingen, as I said, and I just wanted to take a moment and welcome you all to the Young CTAR webinar. Today we will be talking about storytelling and happiness. I am truly looking forward to sharing this information with you all. It's been a long time coming, and I always look forward to working with Young CTAR. The name of this topic today will be storytelling plus connection equals happiness. As you know, Young CTAR's conference is coming up at the end of July or middle July, and the theme this year is happiness. And I wanted to talk a little bit about how the power of storytelling can help to connect individuals and as a result bring not just happiness between the two individuals or the group of people that are going through the process of telling a story, but to talk about how storytelling not only is incredibly beneficial to the storyteller, but also to the listener, and how that power of story is about healing and connection. Again, I'm Kelli McCloud Schingen, and my business is KMS Intercultural Consulting. I have been a longtime friend and a member and a fan of Young CTAR. I've been attending Young CTAR probably since about 2006. Fell in love with the organization and have been a fan ever since. Everyone has a story that will stop your heart. I wanted to share that chat because of the fact that I truly believe that this is a reality. I once heard that a storyteller by the name of Patty Dye said, "The shortest distance between strangers is a story." And I believe at the heart of every person is the desire to see and be seen authentically, and everyone has a story that will stop your heart. I want to tell you a story about a young and fearless and even a little bit reckless Kelli. A long time ago, I was a young driver, and I was dating a jazz musician, and he was performing in another city, and I decided at about 11 o'clock at night to get in my car by myself before cell phones and take a drive to this very secluded part of a city that was in the next state over. Um, while I was making that drive, my tire erupted. I ran over something that burst my tire. I had to pull over on the side of the expressway. It was very dark. There were no street lights. I was miles away from the next exit. I didn't have a cell phone. There were no um, payphones on the on the expressway, of course, at that time. So I knew I needed help, but I wasn't sure how to get it. It was a incredibly secluded area. As I said, it was very, very dark. There were no other people around. There were a few cars on the road, and I was frightened. I had no idea how I would communicate to anyone that I needed help. I had no way to communicate to my family where I was, where I went. I didn't tell anyone. I was frightened for my life. I was sitting on the side of the expressway. Large trucks were the only things that were on the expressway, whirring by me and making my car shake as they whirred. I was afraid to get out of the car to check and see how much damage was done because I knew that people wouldn't be able to see me. I might get hit by a car. And then suddenly I saw lights in my rearview mirror, and a car was pulling over to help. For a moment, my heart raced, and I thought, oh, finally somebody is coming to help me. But then at the same time, my heart raced because I said, oh no, what if somebody is coming to hurt me? There's nobody who can see me here. There was a ditch just off to the side, and I thought this might be my final hour. The gentleman came over to my car, and I saw another head in the car left behind, and I thought, oh no, it's two of them. It's just one of me. He came to my car, he tapped on the window, and I rolled down the window just a little bit, and he said, I see that your tire is flat. Just pop your trunk and I'll help you. I At that time, my heart was still racing. I was frightened to pieces, and I thought, is he really going to help me, or is he going to hurt me? Well, I was very pleased that the truth was that he repaired my tire, and shortly I saw that the head that was in the back of the other car got out, and it was a little boy, and he had a little puppy. And they both came over to the car, and I got out, and I thanked the man a million times for helping me out. And he said, I said, can I offer you some money? He said, no, absolutely not. There was a time when my car had broken down on the side of a road, and there was an old gentleman who got out and helped me, and this is my way of paying it forward. We talked a long time about who he was, how he got there, his children, my story, and we were in that moment connected. I was frightened and then happy, and I was so grateful for the humanity that this man showed me, and I was fearful because of it was the unknown. He gave me hope in a moment when I was frightened. So I share that story with you because I think that it's those moments when we are alone that we feel like we have a desire to connect with someone. We want to be with someone else in that moment, in community. You need help. You want to feel the oneness of humanity at that time. And one of the best ways to do it is through storytelling. I'm telling you that story because I wanted you to understand that I was in a moment, I was frightened. Here was someone who saw me, connected to me, and we in that moment were together. I also share that story because I know that in this moment, I was able to share something with you that you were able to see in your mind's eye. The act of sharing stories can be traced back to the beginning of human history, and storytelling allows us to connect with each other and to make meaning of our world. Our life experiences shape who we are and how we interact with others and the world today. And we carry our life stories along with us on our journey, and they become the most precious gifts that we can offer to each other. When we share our life stories with other people, we open up opportunities for seeing things in new ways, and for grappling with new ideas, and for growing into more respectful and compassionate people. Things like issues of conflict and misunderstanding and issues of oppression, they can all be complicated. And like the story I told you, they can even be frightening. They can be effectively addressed, discussed, and even healed by approaching them through our true stories. So I'd like to share this other quote on storytelling. So if someone brings you a story, if stories come to you, care for them and learn to give them away when they are needed. Sometimes a person needs a story more than food to stay alive. I often tell the story that I shared with you guys when I want to talk about trust, when I want to talk about connecting with someone who is not like ourselves, when we're frightened of the other. So share that story because for me in that moment, it was an opportunity for me to be connected. I had no reason to trust. I had no reason to be connected to this individual. But in a moment when I needed human contact and human caring, someone arrived and gave it to me. It was a gift. There are many benefits of storytelling, but I just want to share just a few that I think are relevant to this conversation today. You can probably remember back to when you were a little kid and your parents would read you a story before bedtime. You would settle in and snuggle up, and there would be something that would just relax you. There would be a calm that came over you. There was a moment to connect with the teller of the story. There was a moment to connect with the characters within the story, and then we relaxed. Our bodies relaxed. We settled in, and we went to a different place. We were transported. Right. So there are benefits to the teller because you'll see things that when the teller is telling a story, they are connected in community with those that they are sharing the story with. There is a connection that is deep between one's humanity to the other's humanity. We are transporting together in this story, in this experience. If you're telling a very personal story, there's healing in that, right? There's also faith that when I share this story with someone else, that not only will they care for that story, but that they will do their best to try to understand my story. The benefit to the listener is that you gain new knowledge, right? You learn whether it is about fictional characters or you learn about true characters. You learn more about my story if I'm telling you my own, right? And in that moment, you also connect to me. You and I have community. We are in a community together, right? There's also healing on the part of the listener. Oftentimes the listener may be hearing a story that resonates with them so deeply that it is something that they have encountered in their own life or in their own experience. And listening to someone else tell the story is an opportunity to begin the healing process on their own experience. And there is a great deal of trust that happens between the teller of a story and the listener to the story, right? Storytelling in the brain. What I think is most important about recognizing the story and how our brain operates. Our brain operates in 4 very key ways when someone is telling a story and when one is listening to a story. Our brain is engaged and we have many neurons firing off when somebody is telling a story. The first one is neural coupling. The story activates parts in the brain that allow the listener to turn the story into their own ideas and experience, thanks to neural coupling. Many of us spend hours watching TEDx talks, listening to people tell their stories. And in those stories, we oftentimes connect. If someone is telling you how they came to overcome a huge burden in their lives, if they have taken on a new opportunity, we oftentimes will listen to that story and then we'll turn that story into our own idea and experience, and we are encouraged by that and we feel compelled to move and act behind that. The second way that our brain reacts to storytelling is through mirroring. The listeners or the audience will not only experience same brain activity to one another, but also to the speaker. So the parts of my brain that fire off when I'm telling my story as you are listening as an audience member, then your brain often will, if you could see it through an MRI, you'll see that the same parts of our brain are firing off at the same time. So again, there is that connection, not just through the telling of the story, but even our brains are responding in a similar way. Dopamine. The brain releases dopamine into the system when it experiences an emotionally charged event, making it easier to remember and with greater accuracy. So you guys will hear someone tell their story, and when you see them again, you'll be, I remember what that person told me about the story, right? I remember their story. They told me this one thing, and you can remember that with accuracy much more, oftentimes better than you can remember that person's name. There have been times when I've attended conferences, and I will look at somebody and I say, oh my God, I can't remember that person's name for the life of me. But I know we had a fantastic conversation at dinner, and I remember that they told me something about their son's graduation, right? Or their son's birthday, or whatever the significant moment was. But the fact is that it releases something in my head that reminds me when I see an individual that I have been connected to them because there was an emotional response. Cortex activity. When processing facts, 2 areas of the brain are activated, but a well-told story can engage many areas, including the motor cortex, the sensory cortex, and the frontal cortex. So when we engage in the process of telling stories and listening to stories, our brains fire off in a way that there is more activity happening in that moment than it is when somebody is simply rattling off statistics to us or facts to us. So the numbers are not as engaging in our brain as it is when someone tells us their personal story. And that's why storytelling is one of the most powerful tools to use, not just from person-to-person interaction, but in an organizational story, right? If you are an organization, a corporation, an institution, the story that you tell is going to be so important that it begins to connect people with your brand. And so if you are using storytelling as a process so that people understand and can connect to your brand, then that will be one that they remember more often. So when you hear certain jingles on television, when you hear certain songs, many ways these songs and these jingles and these catchphrases are a business's way of telling a story in a short period of time, but it's one that fires up all of our brain and connects us. A man by the name of Martin Seligman created this new theory of well-being as we consider the conversation of happiness. Happiness is one of the more popular theories or processes that people are studying today and trying to figure out how does one become more happy in their lives. And happiness seems like it's something that would be incredibly simple to achieve, and yet as we age, we begin to lose those things that connect us with happiness. As a child, there is a certain level of freedom that we give ourselves over to, and are able to achieve happiness in an easier way. As we become an adult, what Martin Seligman says is that we need to think about not just being happy, but the process of well-being. And I believe strongly that storytelling is one way that we can connect to the process of well-being. You'll see here that we have PERMA as an acronym for this new theory of well-being. P is for positive emotions, E is for engagement, R is for positive relationships, M is for meaning, A is for accomplishment. So when you think about the process of telling a story and what it takes in order to be connected to someone's story, all of these things are engaged. So when someone begins to tell a story, the positive emotions are ones that we can connect with almost immediately, right? We have these emotions that are charged, they're fired off, and they connect us. And even if the story that's being told is one that is not a very happy one, it doesn't mean that the emotions that are triggered won't be positive. Okay? Engagement. The engagement that happens between one person and another when a story is being told, the fact that we are connecting in this large way, it's about flow. It's about being one with music in many ways. It's time stopping. And in many ways, when we're listening to someone tell a story, it's about the loss of self-consciousness during that activity, right? When we're talking about positive relationships, there's a way in our positive relationships that as we're engaging in this story with someone else, that there is this connection between my humanity and your humanity. So there's the positive relationship that comes out of that is that we have agreed into we have moved into an agreement between my being the giver and your being the receiver of the story, and the relationship in that cyclical process is a positive relationship. Meaning, as I begin to tell my story, as you listen, not only are you making meaning of my own story, but you're turning that story inward and making meaning of your own. Okay? And the accomplishment on the other side of that is a shared encounter, one that has allowed you into the window of my experience, that has given you new knowledge, not just about my own experience, but has given you new knowledge about how I make sense of the world. And the accomplishment on the other side of that is that we have been connected in that moment, that there is a greater understanding, that we have a stronger relationship between us. And in many ways, we can be united together as we begin to address whatever that issue was, or as we move forward in a co-working relationship. So there are a number of ways that this theory of well-being and happiness connects to the process of telling a story. There's a company that I work with that has decided to use storytelling as a way in order to engage this new theory of well-being. What they started doing was having a storytelling hour once a month where they invite each employee to submit a storytelling proposal so that that individual will have an opportunity to sit for a half an hour to 45 minutes and tell some part of their life story to the group and then engage with question and answers after it's over. The positive relationships that have occurred as a result of that within this company, as well as people looking forward to hearing the stories, the connection that has happened within the workplace has been off the charts, right? Workplace morale has increased significantly. The level of trust that exists amongst the participants is heightened in a way that they were never able to achieve before the process of storytelling. So I encourage you to consider storytelling. Storytelling and community. These are the ways that I want us to consider how we can begin to tell stories. Everyone doesn't have to be someone who's trained in theater and is used to being a storyteller and stand up on stage. There are several ways that we can use story. The first is parables and short stories. So in the event that you are not used to standing up, revealing your own personal story or digging deep and beginning to tell that story, there are other ways through parables and short stories that you can collect on the internet, through books, and I'll be able to share with you a resource that I use all the time. Personal narratives is one of the ways that you can use it. That's one of the things that I shared with you at the beginning, is to tell my own very personal story about an experience in my life when I was frightened, when I was in an unknown space, and when I didn't know who to trust, right? You can tell stories so that you can figure out, or not figure out, but begin to share your experience and how you came to think differently about the world. There's also societal and organizational narratives. So there are ways that you can begin to think about, like I shared before, what is the company story? What is the organization story that you want to tell internally? And what is the organization story that you want to tell in your brand, that you want people to understand when they think about you, that they have a certain feeling? Let's think about Apple. Apple has told quite the story that has created this worldwide phenomenon where people are fully and completely committed to Apple, and not just one product, but to almost every Apple product. So you have a community that has been created as a result of the story that Apple has told about what their product is, what it does, what it can do for you, and it has in so many ways created this community and intensified this community and expanded it in a way. So there's a way to tell an organizational narrative as well. And I will share one of the tools that I use on how to go through the process of peeling back what an organizational narrative might be, or what is a societal narrative that we might need to explore. So let me share with you an example of storytelling in a parable. I have a favorite book that I use all the time. It's called 52 Wisdom Tales from Around the World, and one of my favorite parables or stories is called Feathers. And if you'll allow me, I'd like to read it to you. Long ago, in a small village in Eastern Europe, there lived a man who had a terrible habit of gossiping. His talk had hurt various people in town, and one of these people came to the rabbi seeking justice. The rabbi called the two together. "You've ruined my reputation," the victim charged. "I'm sorry," said the man. "I'll take back my words, and then all will be well." "You can't take back your words," the victim cried. "Oh, of course I can," the man responded. And the rabbi saw that the gossip did not understand the extent of the damage done. And so he decided to use action, which often speaks louder than words. "If you wish to right this wrong and be forgiven for your gossiping," he said, "you must come to the village square tomorrow with your feather pillow." The man was perplexed, but secretly hopeful that he had gotten off easily with the loss of only a pillow. The next day he arrived at the village square. "Here," said the rabbi, handing him a pair of shears. "Cut the pillow and let the feathers fly out, each and every one." Still bewildered, the man did as he was instructed until every feather flew about the square. Some came quickly down while others, lifting on air currents, traveled above the walls of the square. Now, commanded the rabbi, bring me back the feathers, every single one. The man looked upon him as if he were crazy. I cannot catch all of these flowers. Some are near, but some have already gone over the wall. They've gone into every nook and cranny. It would be impossible to gather them all. Impossible, agreed the rabbi. Like trying to take back the words from the rumor you spread? Who knows how far it has traveled and where it will go next? Understanding the effects of his actions at last, the man returned to the victim's house and apologized. He never spoke harmful words of another again. I like using parables because in a story like that, you have an opportunity to listen, to hear what's at the heart of the story. What message is it that I want you to receive about what that story is? And oftentimes by the end, you already know. So while listening, what did you do? And I realize we don't have a poll set up, but if you don't mind, if you can share with me what your response was to that story. So did you visualize the scene? You can share this with me in a chat. You can just pop it in a box. Did you visualize the scene? Did you become physically relaxed? Did you travel to another place and time? Or was it all the above? I'll give you a moment to do that. Visualize and pretty much all above, yeah. All the above, and I was moved at the end. Yeah, thank you. I appreciate that. Someone said that they're so visual that they could actually see. That's fantastic. So thank you guys for sharing that. One of the things that I'd like to reveal to you is that the whole process of story listening, and that's a whole nother workshop that we can provide, is that when we begin to listen to a story and truly engage in someone's story or listening to whatever that parable is, we are transported. We go to wherever that story is taking place. We are there in the moment. Not only can we visualize what's happening, sometimes we even place ourselves in that situation. So when we place ourselves in the story, then we can become so incredibly connected to someone else's story in that moment that we see ourselves in it. I often listen to somebody's story and I even say, I can see myself in that story. I apologize for the ringing in the background. I see myself in that story. And there's a process of being incredibly physically relaxed. We can travel to another place in time. We can connect with somebody's story in such a way that it brings us to this oneness of humanity. There is the power in storytelling that is one that when someone begins to tell their own story, we are not just listening to them as they tell their own story. It would be easy to just disconnect. That's why sometimes when somebody is trying to explain, here is how that hurt me, and then they tell you their story, if we stay in our own stories, then we can get incredibly fixed and continue to be polarized. But when we can engage and really listen as someone is walking you through their experience, not only do you visualize what happened to them, but as I said, you bring yourself into that space as well. So I wanted to share with you that there are many professionals who use personal narrative in their work. There's so many of us in the intercultural field that are beginning to use storytelling even more frequently. Some of us have a background in dramatic arts. Some people are just compelled and love the process and the power of story. And so you will see that there's a growing number of people who are beginning to recognize the power of story and are using it to connect across cultures. Um, you may or may not be familiar with a colleague of ours by the name of Layla Buck. She does several personal narratives for cross-cultural understanding. She is a woman of American and Lebanese background. Her husband is Jewish American, and she tells the story with skill about when she was a young girl and the process that well, not the process, but when she was experiencing a great deal of anti-Muslim um, behavior when she was in college. And she goes through the process of telling that story, what was like, and the contradiction between American women and their ideas of um, what femininity is and what women's independence and power looks like versus what it may look like for a Muslim woman. And it was just skillfully done. She does another story called In the Crossing, which is based on her experience with visiting family in Lebanon in 2006 with her husband, and what that process was like for her as she tells the story, not just of her own experience, but the experience of her family. It's an incredibly powerful piece. Right now, she's doing a production called Hikili, which is her visiting the fact that her grandmother was suffering from dementia, and how as she deteriorated, um, Layla was beginning to recognize that not only was she losing the stories of her grandmother, but she was in many ways losing the language of her grandmother. So she spent a lot of time trying to connect, trying to make sure that she was still finding ways to stay in relationship with her grandmother even towards the end. And that's one of those universal stories that no matter what your culture is, you can connect to the fact that when an elder is about to leave us, that there's not just the loss of the love of that elder, but the loss of that elder's story. So there's my story, Anything But Black. Some of you may have seen that. It's one of my favorites to tell. And it is about my journey to self-love in a society that found little beauty in blackness. Within the African American community, there is this color complex. Some people are calling it colorism. For a long time, it was called internalized racism or internalized oppression, where we begin to believe the dominant stories about our own beauty and our own self-worth. And my journey was to push out of that story and to find love in my complexion, in my hair texture, in my body shape. And I go through the process of being a young girl and wanting to be anything but black, to an adult woman, and now not wanting to be anything but black. And these are two stories that are used pretty regularly in order to connect people. And what I found in telling my story is that originally when I told it, I thought that it was only designed to connect with other young black women who grew up on the south side of Chicago like I did and had similar experiences. But what I've discovered in my doing it in several different countries around the world is that I have found people who I would think have zero in common with me on that very intimate level come up to me afterwards and tell me, Kelly, you told my story. And so, as I said, when you begin to tell your story, when you invite people in, they begin to visualize and not just see you anymore, but see themselves in your story. And that's how we can connect across culture and again, connect that to that PERMA, that PERMA, where we can begin to not just encourage our own well-being, but the well-being of a community. And when there's well-being in ourselves and in the community, happiness is on the other side of that. There's Layla. There's me. Now I want to share with you this storytelling model. Originally, the storytelling model has come from the storytelling for social justice. So it is designed to work with social ideas or social issues that we want to take through the process. So for example, you could run this method through issues of racism, issues of sexism, issues of homophobia, etc. I like to use it for almost anything. So you can see here that we'll be visiting the storytelling model of power and what that power might look like in different, cultures. So let me just begin with the stock story. Now, the stock story is it's public and ubiquitous. It's dominant and mainstream. So it is the story that everybody knows no matter what. So let's just use the United States context for a moment. A stock story in who discovered America would be Christopher Columbus, right? Most people would say, well, sure, Christopher Columbus discovered America, and that's the stock story, right? That's the one that you're taught in school, that you know instinctively. It's almost the first thing that you comes to your mind, right? Even though the conversation has changed a little bit around that, that's still the stock story. The concealed story exists alongside stock stories, and it's stories from the margin. So when you think about what a concealed story might be about the discovery of America, you would recall that you can't discover something where people already are, right? So the fact is that Columbus really didn't discover America, right? There were already people here. And beyond that, some would even say that the Vikings discovered it before he did. We can even go further in this story to recognize that not only did he not discover the United States of America, he discovered the Caribbean, or he landed on the Caribbean. So he never made it up to the continental United States. And so this idea of Columbus discovering America, there are concealed stories that exist within that, right? So all of these other things. He didn't make it. There were already people here. There were other folks who came before him, right? The story of resistance is contemporary and historical, and it challenges the public status quo, okay? And so, for example, the resistance story of Columbus discovering America is the Native American community coming out and saying that's not what happened. And to say that he discovered America is not only untrue, but it's an insult, because when he arrived, what he did was instigated and initiated mass genocide. And so let's tell the true story about what happened. And there was a great push behind that. And even in Canada and the U.S., the Native American people are pushing for, and not just the Native American people, but there is a movement now that supports the resistance story to say, let's tell the whole truth, everybody. And can we move away from Columbus Day and start calling it Indigenous Peoples Day, or Indigenous Persons Day, or the Indigenous Day? So there are a number of different ways that there is a challenge and there's resistance to that story. The counter story is built on resistance and deliberately constructed to challenge the system, right? So what's happening now with the counter story is that we have several examples of areas that are saying we will not acknowledge Christopher Columbus. We will not acknowledge Christopher Columbus Day. We are going to call it Indigenous Peoples Day, and we will change how it is that we think about this and celebrate this day. The idea of this cyclical model is that when the counter story has gotten enough footing, when it's gotten enough support and groundswell, it will then become the stock story. So in a matter of time, we are not going to be talking about Christopher Columbus. We will be talking about Indigenous Peoples Day in a matter of time. And then the stock story, within the stock story, then it will be some concealed stories in that, and the resistance stories. So the whole idea is that it continues to go. It's cyclical in the storytelling process. So let's take a look how we can use that. Let's take a look at that storytelling model of power. When you think about power, whether it's in the United States or even worldwide, oftentimes when you think of those who are in power, they look a little bit like this, right? And so then the idea is that if you don't look like that, then you cannot or you do not have access to power. But what happens when there is a concealed story of other ways that power looks and power shows up? We have Malala as a perfect example. Here's youth, which is often without power. Here's a woman in a community that is often without power, and yet she has risen to being one of the most powerful people, not just in her own community, but worldwide because of the message that she carries and her her resistance to a system and what that has done to energize a world around educating women, about girls having certain levels of power and being able to select their own destiny. The resistance story is really about pushing that we can do it. Not only can we do it, but we've been doing it for a super long time. And so we've seen that we've had to have movements in order to be able to push that envelope. So the resistance story around power is that we will push it so that we can have access to it. Right? During the war, women continued to say, no, I'm not going back home to be a sweet little happy homemaker. I can do this. So I'm going to work. I'm going to give myself more money. I'm going to contribute to the family. It made me feel empowered. I knew that I could. I felt that I was a positive contributor to society, etc. And then, of course, the suffrage movement, there's been these things worldwide for women to be able to stand up and say, we can do this and we will always push against the system. In the U.S., the counter story is that there are women who hold power. There are women who do it in a unorthodox way. There are women who say that you will see me as who I am. And so to use an example of Oprah Winfrey as a counter story is to say not only can a woman do it, but a woman of color can do it, and a woman of color can have great power and great access and great reach. So that's a storytelling model that I would like to share with you guys that can help individuals understand concepts, but it can also help organizations understand their story. So you can go into a company and say, what is your stock story as a company around, let's say, inclusion, or what's your stock story around promotion, so you can walk an organization through this as a tool as well. So storytelling and happiness, these are the things that happen as a result of someone telling their story. There are common themes that connect not just my story with your story, but it also forces us to look at a larger story. So as I talk about my very personal story of going on my journey from wanting to be anything but Black to you couldn't pay me to be anything but Black, as people listen to my story worldwide, they picked out common themes that they could connect with. And in those common themes, it is a shared knowing and the oneness of humanity that exists in that moment. And as a result, it's that certain level of happiness because we get that well-being, the well-being within ourselves and the well-being with others, and we create this community. As I said, this is about shared experiences. So as you listen to someone's story, as you hear someone's story, you begin to connect what are the shared experiences with how do I make sense of and understand what this person's experience is and can connect myself to it, because in this moment, they may not be asking me for help, but they're certainly asking me to engage. There's a developed empathy that happens when somebody is telling their story. And in that empathy, it is validating for the storyteller, thus creating well-being, thus creating happiness. So the same is true for the individual that is expressing that empathy. Again, it is about the shared experience, the connection, and ultimately the oneness of humanity. When we forget that we belong to each other is when we get into cross-cultural conflict. It's when we begin to have the things that are priming us for war, the things that get us, that continue to keep us polarized, to keep us from one another. But when we can begin to understand the stories of others, we can connect to that oneness of humanity. And it's really not about just expressing a certain level of sympathy. This is truly about getting inside of one's story. When you get inside of one's story, it is never just about saying, oh, I feel sorry for you, but more about what can I do? Right? And so in that oneness of humanity, we are connecting to the well-being of the other. And as I said, that's happiness. Wanted to share some of my resources with you. I talked about storytelling for social justice, which is where I pulled feathers from, and storytelling for social justice, which is where I got the storytelling model for power, or the storytelling model that speaks to the stock stories, the concealed story, the resistance story, and the counter story. So what we just went over. Storytelling for Social Justice by Leanne Bell. There is a book available, but there's also an online resource that if you just do the search for Storytelling for Social Justice, there's a PDF that is online that I believe is free to download and to use. The only thing is that there is a form that every time you use it, they want to invite people to share how it is that they're using it and who they're using it with, so that they can continue to keep a record of the impact and the reach of the tool. Doorways to the Soul, 52 Folk Tales from Around the World by Alyssa Davy Piermain. That is where I pulled feathers from. And there are some amazing stories in there that visit all different types of topic that can help you with leadership, that can help you with understanding when you need to take action, how to not let something get away from you. One of my favorites is about building a bridge and bringing two, it's called Old Joe and the Carpenter, about bringing two people who were in conflict together. There are some fantastic stories in there from that can be used as opening to workshops or sessions, or to close, or to help articulate a point. And the Storytelling Trance Experience, which I only just briefly touched on, there's an online article that's available to you, and there's several books available on Amazon and probably at any store that really expresses what happens to us when we go into someone's story, and the connection that is available to us on the other side. And there's the cover of both of these books. Sorry. Okay. And I wanted to share this quote because it truly is one of my absolute favorites, and the reason why I like to use storytelling to connect across culture. Tell me a fact and I'll learn. Tell me a truth and I'll believe. But tell me a story and it will live in my heart forever. I think that when we can begin to connect across cultures, when we can begin to open up and tell our stories, not only can people see us for who we are, but we begin to see inside of ourselves. And I think that that is what will keep us connected to the other, and to create the storytelling community of one that is filled with compassion and empathy and critical for cross-cultural understanding. So I'd like to open up the floor right now to any questions you may have. I think we have about 10 minutes left for questions. Thank you, Veronique. Great work. Any questions? I'm happy to answer some questions for you guys. So one of the things that is coming up too is that Young Sitar, which is the host of this webinar today, we will be putting together the 3-day seminar in Finland, in Tampere, I might be saying that wrong, so I apologize, but in Finland, and there will be 3 days, and it's not going to be a traditional Congress. It's more of an intensive 3-day seminar where we're bringing several different people together. I will also be doing what is the power of storytelling, then take people through an actual workshop, and then there will be other topics as well. Okay, so I see that there's some other questions that came in. Let's see, so what about myths in societies? So I think that the myths in societies are ones that help to explain our story, our cultural story. And so these are, sometimes they change, they take shape, they take a different form, but at the end of the day, in our traditional or older societies that have used ongoing myths, they help to explain certain things. So if you're asking, like, for example, in Greece or the Roman god quote myths, these were to help to explain things that were unexplained, to bring people to a place where we could make sense of why the sun rose, why did people fall in love so intensely, how can we stay safe on the water? And so these types of myths were created in order to make meaning and give people a sense of connection to whatever that thing was, to help to explain the unexplainable. And so I do believe that there is value in them, as long as we begin to peel back the onion of those myths. Do you ever use stories in a pre-post format to demonstrate growth or deeper understanding? In the storytelling workshops that I've done, Chris, we oftentimes either explore personal story, so we may start with just an example of storytelling around the room where people introduce themselves, and we go and we say you can share as much or as little as you like, and you will see that as people will start from a place that is not as open or not as risky, are not as willing to share with themselves. But through the process of the workshop, by the end, we ask them to introduce themselves again, and how they introduce themselves at the end is far deeper, far more willing to take risk, far more trusting, and that could be because of the relationship that has been developed over time and the process that we take people through. Hope that answers your question. Someone says that, Oluwana, I use storytelling a lot. It allows listeners to connect with you, and I love the model of power. You're welcome, yay. There's a 10% discount, again, if you register today for the Young Sitar seminar in Finland. So please visit the website www.youngsitar.org and get registered for that if you like. So the stock story model, how does that play out? Are people honest about the margin or counter story? Well, one of the things that when I use that, Tamara, is I take the group or the workshop or whoever it is that I'm working through, and we peel back these different stories, but I break the room down into several different groups so that one group may not be as honest, but there's without a doubt some group that's going to be deeply honest. We have used race. We've talked about what's the stock story about race, what's the stock story about gender, and peel that. Well, we've even peeled back the story of what is the stock story about who gets to hold power, right? So we touched on that in this, but I have found that people are incredibly honest about what those concealed stories or the stories for the margins are, and we explore them in depth. And then after we take it through the model, then we say, all right, well, what do we need in each of these phases, right? If we can take them all separately, what do we need in order to challenge the counter story in each of these stages? So I do think that people tend to get a little bit more honest with it because they don't always place themselves in the position of power, but they see themselves as a cog in the wheel. How do you deal with your stories that make listeners feel uncomfortable? Have you experienced that? Oh, absolutely. There were a lot of people who are uncomfortable with some of the stories that tend to shake up or challenge the status quo. And when people are uncomfortable, I believe that that is where the change begins. No one makes change from a place of comfort. So if we're talking about issues that are prevalent, so let's talk about all of the gun violence that's happening in the United States, right? People push back against having a real deep conversation about it because it requires people to change, right? And so there's always going to be pushback. People will be uncomfortable, but I feel without a doubt that there has never been ever in the history of time where change has occurred because people are comfortable. Right? Where real meaningful change comes is when people are uncomfortable. But what you have to do is when that discomfort shows up is you have got to keep them safe. You have to keep them as connected as possible. So you have to make sure that you keep them at the center and massage. And sometimes you don't want to. Sometimes you are frustrated by it. That's what they need. But the fact is, you have to keep them. You have to validate their concern and let them know that there is a great deal of value into leaning into that discomfort. Thank you. Thank you. And I hope that you guys were able to hear me. It looks like someone has some issues with internet. Veronique, hopefully. Um, my story of happiness is always that I remain connected to other people when I get a chance to hear their story. My story of happiness is about the process of releasing, sharing, drawing others into my experience, feeling the support and the connection of the other, and knowing that on the other side of it, not only have I only expressed my story, but that I have gained a comrade, someone who is with me in the process and someone who can help me move forward. That's what I believe the process of storytelling and happiness does for us. So if there are no further questions, I want to thank you guys so much for your time. Thank you for showing up in the wee hours of the morning for some of us and for the late evening for others. It's been my pleasure, and I do hope to see some of you in Finland next month.